Hello, everyone, and welcome to Walker Reads. I am your host, MJ Walker, and today I'm bringing you another episode in my series, Rabinoe, Wizard Extraordinaire. If you enjoy what you read, listen, hear, whatever, please don't forget to like and subscribe. It truly helps me to develop my channel and encourages me to keep writing the wonderful things that you enjoy. Without further ado, I bring you Rabinoe, Wizard Extraordinaire. Episode 15, A River Runs Through It. The next morning found Rabinoe and Eris loading up the small handcart and departing from Fadlan, waving at Gabby and Mikkel as they bid them farewell from the door of the inn. The sun was just barely cresting the horizon, dawning fully on the new day. The pair continued in silence until the village was long out of sight. As Rabinoe walked, pulling the cart, Eris curled around his shoulders and snoozed lazily, hardly lifting an eyelid at the birds and small animals bustling all around them. Rabinoe found that maintaining the sustained magic that kept the wheels round was becoming far easier for him, especially after his recent experience with the fox in the woods. As his mind wandered, he thought of the little golden compass the fox had gifted him with. "Say, Eris," Rabinoe broke the silence as the sun crept towards midday. The eternal cat perked her ears but didn't open her eyes. "How do you think the fox came across that compass?" he asked. Eris lifted an eyelid lazily, regarding Rabinoe with a wide yawn. "Does it matter?" "I suppose not," Rabinoe said, "but it is curious, isn't it?" "Not really," Eris answered, closing her eye once more. "Foxes like shiny things." "So we're just going to chalk it up to an attraction to shiny objects?" The cat raised her head, looking at Rabinoe with annoyance. "Why would it be anything more than that?" "I'm not arguing the fox's predilection to hoarding objects," Rabinoe continued. "I'm just wondering how that particular item came to be in her possession." "Speculation is best applied in mathematics, dear rabbit." Rabinoe glanced over at her in exasperation. "But doesn't it bother you? A compass specifically tuned to will magic happens to be in her den, and that is what she gifts us with?" "This line of thinking is leading nowhere productive, rabbit," Eris yawned, closing her eyes once more. "I just think it's odd," Rabinoe said. "That's all." "You've discovered an oddity in a world full of wonder," Eris said sarcastically. "Good for you." Rabinoe sighed in frustration but said nothing more. As the day dragged on, Eris went from his shoulders to the cart to lithely running through the trees after critters that had caught her attention. At one point, she returned from her hunt with a struggling blue jay clamped firmly in her jaws. She settled into the back of the cart and pinned the poor bird with one of her paws, watching the creature struggle with amusement. Rabinoe had opened his mouth to say something to her about torturing helpless creatures when he looked back to see Eris had bit the head off of the bird and was chomping happily on the corpse. He swallowed a wave of revulsion and looked away, hoping the cat wouldn't make a bloody mess on his supplies. The day waned to afternoon, then faded into evening, with no sign of the pair approaching any settlements. As the day's rays finally began petering into sunset, Rabinoe begrudgingly set up camp just off of the road, pitching his small tent and putting together a campfire from tinder he had collected from the woods. He made a small meal from the rations in the cart, not bothering to make a serving for Eris, seeing as she was still intent on terrorizing the local wildlife. Night set fully, darkness claiming the world around them, and Rabinoe watched his campfire burn itself down to embers before he climbed into his bedroll and fell asleep, Eris curled contentedly next to his head. When he awoke the next morning, Eris fully on his face, he extricated the cat, whom complained loudly, and climbed out of his tent. Dawn wasn't yet fully upon them, so Rabinoe broke down his small camp before taking the time to meditate. He went through the motions of flexing his will and expanding his consciousness, finding the task easier to accomplish every time he tried. Finally, the sun fully risen over the horizon, Rabinoe departed, Eris perched on his shoulders and forever bored. Around midday, the pair found themselves rolling into a small village, smaller even than Fadlan had been. The villagers were friendly and cheerfully pointed him in the direction of the village elder, the closest thing the place had to a leader. When they found the man, bent over his garden bed, pruning and weeding with the utmost care, it took several minutes before the man could be convinced to leave his precious plants and see what Rabinoe wanted. "Greetings, young man," he had said when he finally stepped out of the garden and sat on a bench in the shade of his front porch. "I'm Matthias, but you can call me Matt. What brings you to Roseford?" "I'm Rabinoe," Rabinoe replied, inclining his head respectfully towards the wizened old man. "Wizard Extraordinaire. It's a pleasure to make your acquaintance." "That's a bit of an odd thing to call yourself, isn't it?" Matt regarded Rabinoe quizzically and stroked his beard. "Pretty cocky to introduce yourself as such, eh?" "I'm on a pilgrimage," Rabinoe answered, growing more accustomed to this reaction. "And that is the title my master has bestowed on me for this journey." "I see," the old man said with a twinkle in his eye. "Your master must have quite the sense of humor." "You could say that," Rabinoe said, endeavoring not to bring up Lindrem or the painful emotions that accompanied him. "I was actually hoping Roseford might have lodging I could acquire in exchange for small jobs." The old man chuckled. "Look around you, boy," he said, motioning to the small village, which contained a whopping dozen buildings. "This place isn't even big enough for the traders to come through regularly." "I suppose that means there isn't an inn, then." "A correct supposition to make, son," Matt nodded in agreement. "And as far as lodging in exchange for work, we here in Roseford take pride in accomplishing our daily tasks. I'd wager you'd find it difficult to convince anyone to let you sweep their porch, let alone do their chores for them." "I see," Rabinoe said, his hopes dropping down into his boots. "You're welcome to camp in the commons," Matt continued. "But beyond that, Roseford won't have much for you, I'm afraid." "I understand," Rabinoe said, nodding slowly. "Thank you for your time, Matt." "Of course," Matt said, nodding in return. "I wish you the best of luck, Mr. Extraordinaire." Rabinoe left Matthias to his gardening and went walking around, talking to the other villagers, whom confirmed the old man's assertion. No one needed or had want for his help. Sighing to himself, he collected his cart, which he had left sitting in the middle of the village, and made to depart. "Not even going to stay the night?" Eris asked softly in his ear so no one else could hear her. "No point in staying if I can't do anything for this people," Rabinoe responded. "I'm sure there will be someone in the next place that needs my help. No point in hanging around if I'm not needed." "I see," Eris said snidely. She opened her mouth to say more when a voice hailed them from behind. Rabinoe turned to see a man waving at them from the edge of the village. He hurried over to Rabinoe as soon as he realized that he had captured the young man's attention. "Pardon me, young man," the stranger wheezed. "Pardon me, but did I hear you correctly, that you're a wizard?" Rabinoe sighed inwardly. Wizard Extraordinaire, actually. How can I help you?" "Well, you see," the man wrung his hands uncomfortably. "My name is James, and I'm a local farmer here. Well, I haven't always been a farmer here, but nonetheless, I am now." Rabinoe raised an eyebrow at the man. "Okay." "Well, James looked around and stepped in closer, speaking quickly and softly. "I'm not a very good farmer. I inherited my farm a few years ago from my uncle when he passed." "I take it you could use a hand on said farm?" Rabinoe asked with mild amusement. "Shh!" the man said, hushing Rabinoe and looking around wildly to see if anyone had overheard. "If anyone in Roseford knew I was asking for a stranger's help, they'd never let me live it down. And I'm already a bit of a laughingstock around here. I'd rather not make it any worse." "So then why ask at all?" James looked around again before he stepped in even closer, barely an arm's length between them. "Look, could we maybe talk about this away from the village?" Rabinoe sighed and nodded. following as the man led him away from the main road and along the periphery of the village to a small dirt road leading off into the sparse woods. "You truly are endeavoring to get murdered," Eris hissed softly. "Aren't you, boy?" "Hush!" Rabinoe hissed equally softly. Finally, the man began speaking when they were out of sight of the village. "Thank you for indulging me, young man," he said, turning back and grinning at Rabinoe abashedly. "I've suffered quite a bit of disdain from the folks of Roseford. They all seem to believe my uncle made a mistake leaving me the family farm, say that he should have given it to his son. Can't say I don't agree with them, really, but here we are." "So what's the problem?" Rabinoe asked. "Struggling to keep up with the work?" "It goes beyond that," James replied. "My family and I have been working our asses off to keep the farm running, despite us knowing nothing about agriculture. But in the last couple of weeks, something has changed. I don't really understand it, and it's hard to explain, but my crops have begun dying." "Well," Rabinoe said, "if you've been struggling, it's not hard to imagine that you would lose some crops." "You don't understand," James said, looking back at Rabinoe with a haunted expression. "It's not just a few plants here and there. We've experienced that as we learned to tend the place, but it would be best if I just show you. We're nearly there now." The man led them through a final stand of trees into a large, wide open space that housed the aforementioned farm. A small wooden house stood nearby, overlooking rows and rows of neatly tended crops. From the porch of the small house, voices cried out, greeting James as he returned. Two small children of about 5 and 8 years old came running across the grass to leap into the man's arms. "Yes, yes," the man said lovingly. "Daddy's home, my children." He turned to Rabinoe. "These are my kin, Daisy and Orion." Daisy, who was clearly the older of the two, smiled widely at Rabinoe, showing several missing teeth, whereas Orion shyly hid his face in his father's shoulder. "And this," he continued, motioning to the woman walking towards them, "is my wife, Avaranda." "Please," the woman said warmly, "call me Ava." She nodded to Rabinoe before turning to James. "Dearest, I wasn't aware that you were bringing guests home." "I'm sorry, Ava," James said sheepishly, "but this young man is a wizard. I think he might be able to help us." Ava looked at Rabinoe appraisingly. "A wizard, huh? You're a little young, aren't you?" "Rabinoe," Rabinoe introduced himself, blushing. "Wizard Extraordinaire, at your service." Ava raised an eyebrow. "Wizard Extraordinaire?" Rabinoe fidgeted. "I get that a lot." "Oh, I'm sure you do." Ava looked back to her husband. "Do you think this wise, James?" "Please, my dear," James pleaded. "If he can possibly help us, then it is worth every bit of scorn those self-righteous villagers can heap our way." Ava gave James a look full of implicit meaning, nodding slowly. "If you say so, dear." "Well, it certainly can't hurt," he said, blushing deeply. Ava nodded again before looking at her children. "Come now, little ones. Your father and his guests have some things to discuss." The children whined but heeded their mother, holding her hands as they walked back to the farmhouse. James watched them go with a look of deep love and admiration. "Avaranda has been very supportive of my decision to work the land rather than selling it off," he said softly, "and she has suffered a great deal of derision from the people of Roseford for our lack of proficiency in the field." "Are the people of Roseford really that cruel?" Rabinoe asked. "Cruel?" James huffed. "I don't know if I'd call it that, but they are incredibly judgmental. You saw for yourself how prideful everyone is in accomplishing everything on their own." Rabinoe nodded. "Yeah, I definitely picked up on that." "If you were looking for work, which by the sounds of it you were," James continued, "I'd be surprised if you didn't get at least one self-righteous giggle when you offered help, perhaps even some contemptuous stares." "You are very well spoken for a farmer," Rabinoe observed. "That's because I never intended to be a farmer," James laughed. "I studied the long histories of the royal families in Ohangpur, and I was well on my way to becoming a royal historian when my uncle fell ill. He reached out to me and implored me to take over the family farm in his dying hours. He didn't mention what had become of his son, but seeing as my cousin is nowhere to be found for several years now, I can assume he either has no intention of returning or the man is dead. I see, Rabinoe said. Thus began your strife on this farmstead. Indeed, James nodded. Ava agreed to come visit when my uncle was still infirm. We brought our little Daisy with us. She was only about 3 years old at the time. It was bringing Daisy with us that sealed the deal for both of us. What? Rabinoe grinned. Did a 3-year-old become completely enamored with this place? James chuckled. No, it was something far more important. He paused and looked back at the house, looked back into his memories. Daisy could breathe here. Rabinoe frowned. What do you mean? Have you ever been to Ohangpur, son? James asked. Well, Rabinoe sputtered. I kind of grew up in the streets there, but I've been gone for a long time. James nodded to himself. The capital of Galita is going through a tremendous change. Steam power, pressure, and electricity have begun weaving themselves thoroughly into the society. It's an astonishing thing to witness, the birth and subsequent adoption of a new technology, but it has its downsides, Rabinoe finished. Indeed, James nodded. The coal being burned to fuel the massive projects being undertaken has turned the atmosphere sour. A thick smoke often clings to the city well into the noon hours and many times persists all day. The man paused for a moment. We didn't realize just how much the city was affecting our poor Daisy until we got here. Within a day of us being on the farm, she stopped coughing, stopped wheezing. She even had the energy to run around outside, something she had been struggling to do when we were in the city. The smoke was making her ill then? Rabinoe asked. That is what we surmised, James agreed. After seeing the dramatic change in her, we couldn't convince ourselves to go back to Ohangpur. So I left Daisy and Ava here, returned to the city by myself, concluded any business we had left in the city, packed all of our things, and returned to the farm. By the time I came back, my uncle had succumbed to his sickness. He was 3 days dead when I arrived. So you've just been farmers ever since? Pretty much, James answered. Ava was an apprentice seamstress in Ohangpur, and she's very skilled with the needle. So we were able to cajole some of the locals into helping us in exchange for her labors. It took a great deal of effort, but within a few years, we had the farm mostly figured out. I'm guessing this is where the until part comes in, Rabinoe said. Correct you are, young mage. Come. James turned and led Rabinoe and Eris into the rows of crops. About a month or two ago, something changed. We're used to losing some crops to pests and wildlife, even fungal infestations, but nothing like this. James paused as he led them through the crops, and Rabinoe could see that a large swathe of the plants had grown visibly ill, wilting and graying, struggling just to stay alive. As James had said, it wasn't just a handful of crops. Nearly a quarter of the field was blighted in this manner. We have no idea what has changed, James said softly, looking at the crops mournfully. But we cannot stop it. It started in the corner of the field over yonder, he pointed out the corner he referred to, and just spread like a nasty fever. As Rabinoe looked over the dying plants, Eris hissed softly. I agree with you there, my feline friend, James smiled sadly, looking at Eris. None of this makes any sense to us. So this is what you were talking about, Rabinoe said quietly. No wonder you were so eager for my help. James nodded slowly. If this continues, it's likely to wipe out our entire field. Then our worries would go beyond making a profit. We'd be struggling to feed ourselves. Oh, I get it, Rabinoe sighed deeply, turning to James. I'm going to take a look around. Why don't you go check in with your family? I'll come speak with you if I find anything. James seemed hesitant, but nodded. Thank you, Mr. Rabinoe. Please, Rabinoe said. Just Rabinoe. James smiled and nodded once more, but said nothing else, turning and heading back to his home and his family. Rabinoe watched him go until he was obscured by the crops growing in the fields. He surveyed the dying plants with a critical eye, determining where he should begin. "This place is wrong," Eris hissed softly. "There is something sinister at play here." "I felt it too," Rabinoe agreed. "The second we reached this section of the field, something changed." "You are honing your senses well, Rabbit," Eris complimented. "Now the question becomes, can you solve this mystery?" "Of course I can," Rabinoe said confidently, walking slowly towards the corner James had indicated as the starting point of the blight. "Whatever has taken effect over these crops, it must have a source. We just have to find the source and correct whatever it is." "We?" Eris asked incredulously. "I hope you don't think I am going to be helping you." "Why would I ever assume you'd be helpful, Eris?" Rabinoe shot back in irritation. "Now that's just rude." "The truth can hurt," Rabinoe said snidely. "I suppose even you are vulnerable to that, eternal or not." "You know," Eris replied, "sometimes I fantasize about opening your veins in your sleep." She stretched on his shoulder and purred loudly. "It's always such a lovely thought." "If you don't want to help," Rabinoe said dryly, "you are welcome to go play with the kids, or whatever it is you want to be doing instead." "And miss you blunder while you try to figure this out?" Eris purred. "Not a chance, Rabbit." "All right then," he continued. "Then maybe just shut up and let me work." "Sounding more and more like Lynn every day," Eris replied, jumping from his shoulders and sauntering between the crops, sniffing at the ground curiously. Rabinoe sighed, but pushed the cat's antics out of his mind. He had to focus on the task at hand. Something was taking effect over these crops, and it all started in this corner. He reached the edge of the field and scanned his surroundings. There wasn't anything that grabbed his attention as odd. However, he wasn't really expecting any visual markers. Had there been anything of that nature, surely James would have been able to identify it. So whatever was blighting these plants, it would be invisible to the layman. Everything about this situation screamed magical intervention. So Rabinoe sat, just at the edge of the field, at the banks of a small river that ran alongside of the field, feeding its irrigation system, and closed his eyes. Expanding his awareness like he had been practicing every morning, Rabinoe examined the area through the lens of his will. Behind him, he could sense the sickness claiming the plant lives, row after row, moving in slow succession. However, there was something to this sickness that caught his attention, almost like an energy signature. The same signature wove itself into the dirt beneath the crops and wound its way back to the corner where he sat. The energy was strongest beneath him, slowly seeping through the ground below. But where was it coming from? "Oh?" Rabinoe frowned, opening his eyes and looking down. The small river running alongside the crops was positively brimming with the same energy. And just like that, Rabinoe figured it out. The river was being poisoned. And that concludes episode 15, A River Runs Through It, of Rabinoe, Wizard Extraordinaire. I'll be releasing new episodes every Monday morning at 7 a.m. Pacific Standard Time, so if you enjoy, please don't forget to like and subscribe and get that notification when these new episodes drop. Thank you so much for listening. I hope you enjoyed.